The Landing of the Pilgrims by James Doherty. Part 3, starting at page 115, of how they built a strong fort for their defense. The sail did not belong to a French pirate ship, but to a shallop with an English crew from one of Mr. Weston's fishing vessels, the Sparrow. It had come to deliver 7 passengers from Leyden. The visitors brought no supplies other than enough for the return of the shallop's crew. These new arrivals added 7 more mouths for Plymouth to feed, besides the 35 men from the Fortune. The plantation's provisions were nearly exhausted. In desperation, Bradford decided to send to the fishing fleet for provisions. He appointed Winslow to this difficult business. He had been a wise ambassador on all occasions. Winslow now took the long trip up the east coast in the shallop and found the Sparrow and the fishing fleet. When he told them of Plymouth's desperate need, the fishermen gave him what they could spare. Winslow returned with enough food to provide a lean diet until harvest time. In this crisis, Standish, Bradford, and Elder Brewster sat in the meeting house considering future plans. The Indians, knowing of our poor condition, grow daily more insolent, and Massasoit hath taken much offense and cometh no more unto us as formerly, said the governor gloomily. Then he added, hunger and weakness doth greatly discourage our people. And the sin of idleness will do worse, said Captain Standish, rising and pacing the floor. Brewster opened the great brass-studded Bible on the table before him. Lift up the hands that hang down, and strengthen ye the feeble knees, he read. Thus saith the prophet Isaiah. Methinks this is the Lord's counsel to us to arise and build a fort on top of the mount, and there place our cannon. It will greatly set back our enemies, mused the captain, looking out the window toward the mount. Such the fort could serve as a meeting house and would greatly encourage our people in their worship of God, replied Elder Brewster vigorously. At the town meeting, every man's vote was cast in favor of building the fort. Soon the hills echoed with the clamor of axe and saw and hammer. Work took men's minds off the gnawing emptiness under their belts. They talked gaily or grimly and jested as they worked. It gave them a lift of heart to see the wooden walls rise higher day by day. May came, and with it planting time. Shifts of workers left the fort and went to the fields to set corn. On the flat roof of the fort were planted 4 cannons. Within were a goodly meeting hall, a gun room for muskets and ammunition, and a guardhouse where lawbreakers were to be kept. Now the fort is finished, we shall keep a guard there, said Mr. Winslow to the captain, as they stood on the roof of the new building and looked out over their fields, green with new corn. It will utterly discourage the Indians from rising against us. Concerning the coming of the Charity and the Swan, and of the great sickness that came upon Massasoit, and how Master Winslow did marvelously recover him. One day, toward the end of June, 2 ships sailed into Plymouth Harbor. They were the Charity and the Swan, sent by Mr. Weston in England to begin a plantation on Massachusetts Bay. The 60 newcomers asked to stay at Plymouth until their surveyors could find a good place to settle somewhere in Massachusetts. The long-suffering colonists of Plymouth took these visitors into their homes and shared with them their lean rations in Christian charity. The Weston men proved themselves a graceless crew. Some helped to weed and tend the cornfields by day. Others, by night, stole and ate the unripe ears of corn. At last this band of ruffians departed in the Swan for their new colony on the bay, and the Charity returned to England. Before leaving for Massachusetts, the newcomers left their sick in the care of Surgeon Samuel Fuller, at his own charge. As they recovered, the doctor sent them to Massachusetts. Shortly after, the Bay Indians came to Bradford with bitter complaints that the newcomers were robbing the Indian cornfields. The governor could do no more than advise the new settlers to deal honestly with the Indians. Before the coming of Weston's men, the Plymouth settlers had planned to start a trading post on the bay. By August, the provisions at Plymouth were exhausted. 2 more ships arrived, the Discovery, Thomas Jones' master, and the Sparrow, a smaller ship belonging to Weston. The Sparrow carried a cargo of fish. Captain Jones of the Discovery had plenty of supplies which he was willing to sell at top prices, though he demanded in exchange beaver skins at below their current market value. These unlooked-for provisions were enough to keep them till harvest time. Had not the Almighty in his all-ordering providence directed him to us, it would have gone worse for us than ever it had been, or after was. The unruly Weston colony at Wessagusset, Weymouth, on the bay, soon used up all their provisions. Winter was at hand. They sent to Plymouth, proposing that the two plantations join in trading along the coast with the Indians for corn. The Weston men would furnish their ship, Swan, for this purpose, and the proceeds would be divided between them. The Plymouth colony agreed, but Standish, their usual leader, was sick with fever, and so Governor Bradford led the expedition. Squanto, too, went along, promising to guide the Swan around the Cape and through the shoals of Pollock's Rip. Not long after they left the harbor, fierce winter storms beat down on them and forced them to turn back. However, they traded with the Cape Indians and collected some 28 hogsheads of corn. During this voyage, Squanto was taken ill with an Indian fever. Within a few days, he died, asking the governor to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. The corn was divided, and the Weston colonists returned to Wessagusset. Captain Standish had now recovered and went along the Cape in the shallop, trading for corn in the bitter January weather. Through the long winter, he came and went, trading and treating with the sometimes treacherous Indians. Once he barely escaped an Indian plot on his life by a notable insulting villain, Wittawamut, whose hands were stained with the blood of many a castaway English and Frenchman. The fearless captain and his men came back in the weather-beaten shallop with corn enough to keep alive the families in the Plymouth cabins. The flame of hope and faith was kept aglow through the lean winter days and nights. One day an Indian came with news that Massasoit was sick unto death. The Plymouth folk had not heard of the chief since the quarrel over Squanto, but this was not the time to harbor ill will. After all, the great chief had been and still was their faithful ally. Bradford appointed Winslow to visit the sick sachem. With him went Master John Hampden, a visiting gentleman from London who wanted to see the country. Hobomok was their guide. On the way, they heard that the chief was dead. When they reached Massasoit's village, they found that the sachem was still alive. From his lodge came the chanting of the medicine men. Enough din to make a well man sick, thought Winslow. The lodge was crowded with sorrowing friends who believed their chief as good as dead. 6 squaws sat around the sick man, chafing his arms and legs. Winslow saw at once that Massasoit was indeed at the point of death. He had lost his sight and his jaws were set. As the Englishman leaned over him, the dying man reached out a feeble hand and groaned, "Keen Winslow? Is this you, Winslow?" For the Indians could not say "I." And he added, "Oh, Winslow, I shall never see you again." Winslow explained through Hobomok that the governor had sent him to say how sorry he was to hear of his friend's sickness. He had sent medicine and such things as he thought might most likely to do him good. If Massasoit would take it, Winslow would give him the medicine at once. Winslow had to force the concoction between the Indian's clenched teeth with his knife. The sick man swallowed for the first time in 2 days. The Englishman then washed his mouth and scraped his furred and swollen tongue. In a few minutes, the sick man asked for a drink, and the amateur doctor poured more medicine down his throat. Within half an hour, Massasoit opened his eyes. Winslow leaned close to his face and smiled. "Massasoit will live," he said. "Soon he will be restored to health and strength." In a few moments, Massasoit was asleep for the first time in days. Winslow sent off a note to Surgeon Samuel Fuller asking for more physic and a couple of chickens with seasoning for a broth. Among the Indians, the news spread that the sachem had been restored to health. A miracle had been brought about by the white man's medicine. When the chief awoke, he was hungry. He asked Winslow to make him some soup of wild ducks, such as he had tasted at Plymouth. At once Winslow set to work to prepare a thin soup of cornmeal flavored with strawberry leaves and sassafras root. After eating this, the chief was strong enough to sit up. Massasoit's confidence in Winslow was now boundless. He insisted that the Englishman visit every sick Indian in the village and give him the same treatment. It was an unfamiliar task for Winslow, but he did the best he knew how and went among the sick in the foul-smelling lodges. With wonderment, he blessed God for giving his blessing to such raw and ignorant means. After Winslow had seen all the other sick and ailing Indians, Massasoit wanted more broth. Winslow took his gun and soon came back with a fat duck. Presently the savory soup was ready. Winslow told Hobomock to skim the fat from the top, as it was entirely too rich for the weak stomach of the convalescent, but Massasoit would not permit it and quickly swallowed several helpings of the rich dish. In an hour the sachem was again a very sick man. He was vomiting and, what was worse, bleeding severely from the nose. This, the Indians believed, was a sure sign of death. But presently the bleeding ceased, and Massasoit slept as Winslow watched by his side. When he woke, Winslow bathed his face and urged his friend to take things slowly until he was stronger. He soon could sit up and receive visitors. When the chickens were brought from Plymouth, the chief decided he would not eat them. Instead, he would keep them and start a poultry farm. Massasoit's Indian friends came from as far as 100 miles to see the miracle. The chief told them, "Now I see the English are my friends and love me, and whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness they have showed me." How Massasoit disclosed a most villainous plot, and of the bold actions of Captain Standish. On the night before the Englishmen were to return to Plymouth, Massasoit gave Hobomock a secret message for Winslow. Hobomock confided it to him as they marched homeward through the woods. The Indians were planning to attack and destroy the 2 English colonies. The Massachusetts, the Narragansetts, the Cape Cod Indians, and even those of the Isle of Capawack, Martha's Vineyard, were in league to wipe out Weston's colony because of their many crimes against the Indians. After this, they would destroy Plymouth. Massasoit had been pressed to join the others, but he had not done so. He urged that Governor Bradford find and kill the conspirators at once. If the settlers waited until they were attacked, it would then be too late. No one knew better than Winslow how weak were the 2 little towns on the ocean frontier. He and his party hurried on through the forest toward Plymouth. That evening they accepted an invitation from their old enemy Corbitant to spend the night at his lodge. It was a chance to get better acquainted with a powerful chief and perhaps pick up further news of what was afoot. They spent a rare night in talk at Corbitant's lodge. "How did 2 men alone dare come so far into the Indians' country?" asked Corbitant. "Where there is true love, there is no fear," parried Winslow, quoting his Bible. "Then why, when we come to Patuxet, do you stand guard and point your guns at us?" the Indians asked. "On land and sea, the English thus salute those they wish to honor," said Winslow. Corbitant shook his head and said he liked not such salutation. "Why do you ask a blessing on your meals before you eat, and give thanks for the same?" the chief asked more seriously. Winslow was now on the firm ground of Puritan doctrine, as he explained. "Whatsoever good things we have, we receive them from God, and as the author and giver thereof, and therefore crave his blessing on that we had, and were about to eat, that it might nourish and strengthen our bodies. And having eaten sufficient, being satisfied therewith, we again return thanks to the same our God for that our refreshing." Corbitant said that this was good, and that the Indians believed almost the same things, and that the same power the Englishmen called God, they called Caetitan. This caused Mr. Winslow to change his views about Indian godlessness. He now went on with growing fervor to explain about God's works of creation and preservation, of his laws and ordinances, especially of the 10 Commandments, all of which they hearkened unto with great attention, and liked well of. Perhaps they accepted the 7th commandment, which Corbitant thought held a man down too strictly to 1 wife, about which we reasoned a good time. Winslow always remembered that night as the most interesting he had ever spent among the Indians. Hurrying on next day, they met Indians who said that Standish had gone to Massachusetts. On their arrival at Plymouth, they found Standish had returned, being providentially turned back by contrary winds. At Plymouth, too, they learned that a messenger had brought a letter from Sanders, the overseer at the Bay Colony. The people of the colony had eaten their seed corn. They had traded everything, even their shirts, to the Indians for corn. Now the Indians refused to sell them any more. Sanders proposed attacking the Indians and taking their corn by force. Would Plymouth join them in making war? It had always been the policy of Plymouth never to attack the Indians, but to stand on the defense. They sent word to Sanders, urging him not to attack the Indians. After he had heard this news, Winslow told about the Indian conspiracy and Massasoit's advice to seize the conspirators and thus break up the plot. Immediately, all Plymouth was called to a meeting to decide what must be done. Plainly, it would be dangerous this time to wait for the Indians to attack. So Bradford, Allerton, and Standish were appointed to determine what action to take. Standish was instructed to go to the Bay Colony with as many men as he chose and tell them of the plot. He was not to make trouble with the Indians, but seek out the conspirators and deal with them, especially their chief, that bloody and bold villain Witawamet, whose head he was expressly ordered to obtain. Captain Standish picked 8 of his best men. A greater number might excite the Indians' suspicions. The shallop was made ready with arms and provisions. Tomorrow she would set sail on her dangerous mission. Danger was the captain's business, and he was never happier than when he was facing it. At last he would come to grips with the scheming Witawamet. How Witawamet lost his head. The company in the shallop made a 40-mile run along the coast in a fair breeze. Sheltered in a deep bay, they found the Swan at anchor. When they came alongside and hailed her, there was no answer. Climbing aboard, they found no one on the ship, not even a dog. Perhaps they had come too late. Had the Indians massacred the colony? They fired off a musket and then another. The shot echoed across the water. After a while, they heard a shout. On the wooded shore, they could see a group of men. It was the master of the Swan and her crew. "But why have you abandoned the ship?" the amazed Captain Standish asked the Swan's master. "Oh, we get along very well with the Indians, practically live among them," the master replied. "We have no need of either guns or swords." To this, Captain Standish answered somewhat dryly, "If there is no need, I am the gladder." Standish was then told that Sanders had gone on a voyage to the fishing fleet seeking provision. In the meantime, the captain would find Sanders' lieutenants at the town nearby. To the shiftless crew at Wessagusset, Standish explained the Indian plot and offered to take back to Plymouth anyone who wanted to go. All the men were ordered in at once from the outlying woods and camps. That day an Indian came into the post from the forest with his furs to trade. When he returned to his tribe, he reported that he had seen in the captain's eyes that he was angry in his heart. This Englishman had discovered their secret. Next day, a tall Indian, who said his name was Peckswat, came into the town and talked with Hobomok. "Tell the captain we know, but fear him not." "Neither will we shun him," said Peckswat, "but let him begin when he dares. He shall not take us unaware." The captain was not accustomed to such talk from an Indian. More Indians came, and there were more insulting speeches. The braves sat in the compound, sharpening their knives in the captain's very face. He choked down his rage and said nothing. One morning, as Standish sat cleaning his musket, the door of his cabin opened softly. There stood before him the powerful figure of Witawamet. Across his nose were painted 3 black stripes. His eyes glittered in his dark face, and on his mouth was a faint smile. He lifted the knife that hung from a cord about his neck. Pointing to the handle, on which was crudely cut the face of a woman, he said with an insolent sneer, "I have another at home with which I have killed many French and English. On it is a man's face. By and by these two shall marry." Peckswat, who had come in without knocking, began a speech in which he implied that the captain was a cowardly runt who should be at work in the fields with the women. Standish understood enough Indian to get the full import of the insult, and his anger strained like a hound on the leash, but he made no reply. As Witawamet left, he pointed again to his knife and said, "By and by it shall see. By and by it shall eat, but not speak." "You shall soon have a lesson in talking knives," muttered the captain to himself. The next day, 4 Indians came to the captain's house. Witawamet brought with him his brother, a young Indian of about 18. The gigantic Peckswat was accompanied by a brave, nearly his size and of equally villainous expression. The Indians, as usual, were naked to the waist. From their necks hung sheathed knives. There were 3 soldiers in the room besides Standish and Hobomok. Each Englishman wore a steel corselet. When the Indians were all in the room, Standish nodded his head slightly. At the signal, Hobomok noiselessly closed and barred the door. Peckswat began a bragging speech. In the middle of it, Standish made a sudden leap, and, snatching the Indian's knife from its sheath, he buried it to the hilt in his breast. In an instant, the room was a shambles of struggling men and stabbing knives. Wittawamut, bleeding from a dozen terrible knife wounds, rolled on the floor, grappling with his attacker. With unbelievable toughness and strength, the Indians kept up the unequal fight. Hobomok stood motionless against the wall, coolly watching the fierce action. Pecksuot, in his death agony, still grappled with the captain. Suddenly, it was over. 3 bodies lay on the floor in pools of blood. The youngest Indian had somehow escaped with a few cuts. "Take him out and hang him from the nearest tree at once," ordered Standish. He bent over the body of Wittawamut and, with the Indian's own knife, severed the head. Hobomok stepped forward and, with his foot, pushed the body contemptuously, saying, "Yesterday, Wittawamut say he big and strong. He say captain little man. Today, little captain big enough to lay Wittawamut on the ground." The Weston men refused to return to Plymouth with Standish. They joined the fishing fleet and returned to England. All Plymouth turned out to welcome the return of the shallop. Standish marched up the fort hill at the head of his little troop. In the crowded meeting house, he drew from a bag the bloody head of Wittawamut and held it on high. It was placed on a pike on the wall of the fort, after the English custom, as an example to enemies. This was a day of triumph and thanksgiving. Elder Brewster said that Captain Standish had been a David and a Gideon to them and had greatly cast down their enemies. The fate of the chief conspirator, Wittawamut, spread terror through the forest, and the Indian Confederacy was broken up. Whole tribes left their fields and villages and fled in terror to the swamps, where many died from disease and starvation. In the abandoned compound of Weston's colony at Wessagusset, the grass and weeds grew, and the sumac and the goldenrod took possession. The Indians avoided the neighboring forest, where the spirits of Pecksuot and the headless Wittawamut walked in the moonlight when the wind wailed and mourned in the naked treetops. How began free enterprise because some wished not to work for the community, and of the sore drought that came upon them. 1623. Spring had come. It was March, and the frost had come out of the hard ground, leaving soft and wet mud. The last handfuls of corn were being given out in equal rations from the common store. Only the precious seed corn for planting was left. On it depended the settlers' survival from starvation. The time for their third planting was at hand. Each year, the governor divided the common land equally among the families. The soundest church members usually got the best lots. Last year, this had caused discontent, and there had been grumbling. Some were workers, and some were shirkers, but all received equal amounts of food from the common supply. This was taken up at the town meeting. It was decided that each family should keep the crop it raised on its allotted land. Each little farm would be a free enterprise. There would be no more common store. Each would work for himself. The result was wonderful. Each family, even the women and the children, worked in the fields daily from dawn till dark. Every inch of each field was planted and tended. There never had been such a planting. They had no plows, horses, or oxen. With spades and mattocks, they loosened the earth, planted 2 fish in each hill, and dropped in the hard kernels. At night, they took turns watching to keep the animals from digging up the fish. The lean and ragged colonists tended their greening fields with a new pride and energy. The laziness and indifference of community had vanished like the sea mist before the sun. It would be weeks before their crops were ripe. They had long ago ceased expecting a supply ship from England. In summer, the wild fowl were hard to shoot. Each day now, starvation stared them in the face. At their feet, the Great Bay was teeming with cod, herring, bass, and a dozen kinds of fish. They had seen grampuses, whales, and seals. Squanto had showed them where there were shellfish and eels in abundance. They were used to the roast beef of old England and to the bread, cheese, and butter of Holland, and they hated fish. But now, if they would not starve, they must take the harvest of the sea. There was only one boat, but they worked it in relays. One crew took her out as soon as another came in. Neither did they return until they had caught something, though it were 5 or 6 days before, for they knew there was nothing at home, and to go home empty would be a great discouragement to the rest. When the shallop was out long or came back with a small catch, the men dug clams from the mud at low tide and caught lobsters, crabs, and shellfish. Now and then the hunters brought in a deer or two from the woods. From day to day they lived on what the Lord provided. and were thankful. May passed with fair weather. Indeed, the weather was too good. Day after day they watched the unclouded sky as the corn drooped and turned yellow for lack of rain. It had not rained for 6 weeks. Hopes of an abundant harvest from their well-tilled fields faded. Upon which they set apart a solemn day of humiliation to seek ye Lord by humble and fervent prayer in this great distress. All day in the crowded meeting house on the hill they prayed, thanking God for his blessings. The service had continued over 8 hours, and the sun had shone all day in the brassy July sky. For all ye morning and the greatest part of the day was clear weather and very hot, and not a cloud or any sign of rain to be seen. Yet toward evening it began to be overcast, and shortly after to rain with such sweet and gentle showers as gave them cause of rejoicing and blessing God. It came without either wind or thunder or any violence, and by degrees in that abundance, as that ye earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken ye decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made ye Indians astonished to behold. And afterwards the Lord sent them such seasonable showers, with interchange of fair warm weather, as through his blessing caused a fruitful and liberal harvest, to their no small comfort and rejoicing. For which mercy, in time convenient, they also set apart a day of thanksgiving. How came the good ship Anne and the pinnace Ye Little James with many goodly people, and how each gathered his corn in abundance. August 1623. August came. The tasseled corn waved its green banners to the sun. The silk on the full ears was turning brown. The boom of the signal gun turned all eyes seaward to where a fleck of sail gleamed on the horizon. It was the supply ship Anne. 10 days later, her consort, the pinnace Little James, came in. The two had been separated in heavy weather at sea. Together they brought 60 new colonists to Plymouth. Many were from the Leyden congregation. Among them were wives and children of men who had been waiting for them for 3 years. Of the rest, Bradford wrote, some of them being very useful persons, and became good members of ye body, and some were so bad as they were fain to be at charge to send them home again ye next year. The new arrivals were dismayed at the gaunt and ragged veterans of New Plymouth who welcomed them on the beach. Some were discouraged by the meager meal of fish, lobster, and cold spring water, with no bread, that was offered them. The colonists had discovered in America that water was an attractive and healthy drink, but in England most men drank only beer and looked on water as unhealthy and dangerous. 60 more new mouths to feed raised serious problems. Later, at harvest time, the Plymouth planters would have plenty. In the meantime, the newcomers were afraid that the planters would soon eat up the provisions they had brought. So it was agreed and sanctioned before Governor Bradford that the planters should keep all of their crops if they did not accept any of the newcomers' supply. The newcomers could keep the provision they had brought if they did not claim any of the planters' corn when the harvest was ripe. All law-abiding newcomers, not of the Plymouth Company, were welcome to the colony, but they must donate an annual bushel of corn to the general store kept for emergency and serve in the common defense. They would not have trading privileges with the Indians because this trade the Pilgrims kept strictly for themselves. That year, each family gathered the full ears and brought in great heaping baskets to fill their bins with golden plenty. Under the new system, those who had abundance could sell or barter with those who would buy. Some of ye abler sort and more industrious had to spare and sell to others, so as any general want or famine hath not been amongst them since to this day. The sailing of the Anne and of the great fire that perilously threatened the community provision, but was notably prevented and assuaged. The Anne was taking on her cargo of clapboard and all the beaver and other skins the colony had. She was taking back a few passengers who had come over to visit the country, and others who, being discontented, did not want to remain. The crews of the Anne and the Little James went ashore. They had assembled about a keg of rum in a house adjoining the general storehouse, and were making a night of it with songs and drunken gaiety around the fireplace, where flames blazed against the cold. The fire roared up the chimney, and a stiff wind sent the sparks swirling in the darkness. A spark started a fire in the thatched roof, and it soon blazed up in the wind. The dreaded cry, "Fire!" rang through the town. "Save the storehouse, or we be overthrown," cried the captain. Men rushed into the blazing building with wet blankets and beat the flames back from the storehouse. But the wind had carried the flaming sparks to the roofs of neighboring houses. 2, 3, 4 houses were ablaze. The wind whipped the flames into a devouring furnace. In the lurid night, in the lurid light, men and women rushed to and fro, etched against the blackness of the night. Some urged Standish to throw the goods out of the storehouse before fire reached it, but as the captain scanned the evil faces of the drunken seamen, he saw that they were hungry for loot, and at once he ordered his soldiers to guard the storehouse and allow no one to enter. Furiously, the men of Plymouth beat at the flames, and the women brought water and wet blankets. Someone yelled mockingly, "Look out! Take a good look around you, and you will see some who are not your friends." The rumor spread that the fire was the result of a wicked plot to rob the storehouse. The flames reduced everything around the storehouse to smoldering embers, but the building itself was saved. The blackened framework of the adjoining houses stood stark against the dying fires. In the ruins of the house where the fire had started, a smoldering firebrand was found against the wall where it had been thrust in among dried leaves. It could not possibly have come there by accident. This discovery was certain evidence of the hand of villainy. Whatever had been the evil intent, Plymouth had again been saved from ruin. The burned houses were those assigned to newcomers who were not of the company. As these people were now homeless, most of them took passage on the Anne for England, for which there was small regret, either among those who left or those who stayed. As the Anne, with her villainous crew, dropped below the horizon, Governor Bradford turned back toward the town with a sigh of relief. By the grace of God, Plymouth had frustrated Indians, traitors, rogues, drought, fire, and starvation. The settlers had begun a great work, and none would leave it until it was finished, or the doing was passed on to those who would follow. Good news from New England, September 1623. Bradford had grown weary of the complaining and accusing letters from the merchant adventurers in England, weary of waiting for supply ships that brought more hungry mouths to feed, but never a barrel of flour. He must send someone to London to tell the truth about Plymouth. It must be someone who could wheedle out of those scheming tradesmen the tools and supplies to keep the Plymouth folk alive in a desolate land. Winslow could tell the story, for he had lived every grim day of it. This man, who had dealt with Indians in the forests of New England, could surely deal with the schemers of Old England. More important, Winslow had written a day-by-day story of New Plymouth from the beginning. This he would have printed in London for all England to read. Being something of a merchant himself and a good advertiser, Winslow shrewdly called the pamphlet "Good News from New England." It was a stirring tale, manfully told, and ended with these stout words: "If ever any people in these later ages were upheld by the providence of God after a more special manner than others, than we, and therefore are the more bound to celebrate the memory of his goodness with everlasting thankfulness. For in these forenamed straits, such as our state, as in the morning we had often our food to seek for the day, and yet perform the duties of our callings, I mean the other daily labors to provide for aftertime. And though at some times, in some season, at noon, I have seen men stagger by reason of faintness for want of food, and yet ere night, by the good providence and blessing of God, we have enjoyed such plenty as though the windows of heaven had been opened unto us. How few, weak, and raw were we at our first beginning, and there settling, and in the midst of barbarous enemies, yet God wrought our peace for us. How often have we been at the pit's brim, and in danger to be swallowed up, yea, not knowing until afterward that we were in peril, and yet God preserved us. Yea, and from how many that we yet know not of, he that knoweth all things best can tell. So that when I seriously consider of things, I cannot but think that God hath a purpose to give that land as an inheritance to our nation." He knew that this would sound well in Puritan ears, and so with this first American scripture in his pocket, he went aboard the Swan. From the ship's deck, he watched New Plymouth recede slowly into the blue haze of the New England coast. The coast itself faded and soon vanished as the west wind filled the sails of the Swan, bound for England. 20 years later, 1648. After Plymouth had prospered, mischievous men had come seeking to sow strife and discord for their own gain. But the Lord's faithful had stood together in unity and had undone their wicked designs. These schemers and rioters had been patiently reproved. Those who had been found guilty after a fair trial had been put out of the colony or sent back to England. Children had been born in Plymouth, like their fathers and mothers before them. These boys and girls were the grandchildren of the first comers. They were still living in the year 1648, 30 of the old stock who had come in the Mayflower. The seed of liberty had taken root in this New England earth. A tree had sprung up that would someday fill the whole world. Truth seekers, like the fowls of the air, would find shelter in its branches. Each year, thousands were coming in crowded ships. New England was dotted with growing towns as far as the Connecticut Valley. Even beyond, young men with axes and plows and Bibles were pushing into the westward forest, saying, "It is not with us as with other men whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves at home again." The end.